Hello and welcome to EIR News Live. My name is Daniel Burke, and I'll be with you for the next half hour along with my friend Michelle Aaron. We're going to cover what's in the daily alert from EIR today, and then we're going to show you a remarkable interview with former President of Guyana, Donald Ramotar. Former President Ramotar is in discussion with EIR's Dennis Small, and they will take up the extremely grave danger of not only a US war on Venezuela, but the potential of nuclear war. What can be done to bring about the new paradigm of peace through development that is the mission of Helga LaRouche, the International LaRouche Movement, and of our program here. We want to get you brought into that new paradigm and make it happen. So we'll begin today with the lead to the briefing, which you can find at eir.news, where you can subscribe for $10 a month to receive everything, some of which we're not going to cover today. And therefore, I'm going to pass it over to Michelle to begin with the lead.
All right. Hi, thank you, Daniel. Today's lead launches on a beautiful picture of a tremendous number of conferences and meetings taking place in the Far East, which are intersected by the visit of US President Donald Trump to those areas. Today's lead, thanks to Marcia Mary Baker, is titled Trump-Xi Summit, a case for the coincidence of opposites approach. The summit of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, including leaders of 11 member countries and invited nations, ended on October 28th in Malaysia. While, meantime, delegations are starting to arrive in South Korea for the October 31st to November 1st meeting of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, APEC, involving 21 member nations. These convocations, along with important side meetings and accords, for example, between ASEAN and India, ASEAN and China, and others, take place in an Asia which is in the midst of a profound transformation, marked by collaboration for beneficial projects, trade, and multinational relations. The countdown of arrangements is now fully underway for the important meeting Thursday, tomorrow, October 30th, in the old Korean capital of Gyeongju, the meeting of China's President Xi Jinping and US President Donald Trump. In several ways, this meeting in Eastern Asia places them in the domain of the extraordinary international deliberation that took place the first week of September this year in China and Russia, where dozens of leaders conferred during the sequence of three gatherings from the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in Tianjin to the Beijing 80th anniversary of victory in World War II to Vladivostok for the Eastern Economic Forum. Trump began his week-long Asian tour October 26th in Malaysia to attend the US-ASEAN Summit, where he met with Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim, who is committed to developing trade relations with China and strengthening the BRICS, which it joined as a partner country on January 1st of this year. So while this is a sidebar, while much of US media emphasized Trump's dance on the runway out at this meeting with the Malaysian Prime Minister, also notable is that Malaysia has recently begun to join the BRICS. And this is the leader who Trump was meeting with. So this week they proposed joining the BRICS, Malaysia, as a full member. 9 of the 11 BRICS nations participated in the ASEAN summit with varying delegations. Of those, Indonesia is an ASEAN member. The others were guests and included South Africa's President Ramaphosa, India's Prime Minister Modi, who participated by video, China's Premier Li Qiang, Russia's Deputy Prime Minister Overchuk, Brazil's President Lula da Silva, and others. This occasion marked the first ever Brazilian participation. Trump had a very timely discussion with Brazilian President Lula da Silva, who, it is hoped, briefed the American leader on the acute dangers of his anti-China policy in South America. So we have two more developments on this. Yesterday, President Trump was in Japan, where the U.S. has 120 military installations and 50,000 troops stationed. Defense matters, along with trade, figured in his trip. He gave an address to the troops on the USS George Washington under a huge banner reading, "Peace through Strength." He was joined in this by Japan's new Prime Minister, Sanae Takaichi. There are multiple angles of their discussions. She has already delivered a few shocks since recently taking office. In her first address to the National Diet Parliament on October 24th, she announced her government's intention to resolve its long-standing territorial dispute with Russia and to reach a peace treaty with Moscow. As for China, she emphasized the need to foster constructive and stable ties with Beijing, and had already announced, contrary to expectations, that she would not support Washington's trade war against the Asian giant. Today, President Trump is in Seoul for a state visit. South Korea's President Lee Jae-myung, in office since June, hopes to improve relations with both China and North Korea, and is now attempting to obtain a reduction on the sweeping tariffs imposed by the Trump administration. Following the visit of U.S. President, Lee will host this year's APEC meeting over October 31st to November 1st. A month from now, Lee will host President Xi Jinping for a state visit. Bit louder, Daniel.
Thank you. To conclude it, these activities are part of the immediate backdrop to the Trump-Xi summit. On the U.S.-China trade front, after intense talks were held between U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and China's chief trade negotiator Li Chenggang a few days ago, Bessent announced October 26 that a very successful framework had been created. Li told reporters on October 27 that a preliminary consensus had been reached. Under that framework, there are to be such measures as the U.S. reportedly withdrawing the threat of imposing a 100% tariff on Chinese exports, and China not implementing a worldwide export control regime and likely resuming purchases of U.S. soybeans. Thus, progress appears to have been made, but it is up to the respective presidents to examine the conditions and make the final decisions. Beyond trade and tariff considerations, there's much more at stake for the world in the evolution of U.S.-China relations. This is best taken as an opportunity for great power collaboration by the global North in the drive by the global majority for development, which is the basis for peace in the world. There's no standing invitation for such positive relations that can last indefinitely. Threats of war, even nuclear exchange, worsen. In Europe, the crazed militarization drive now has an increasingly loud demand for more nuclear arms sharing between the UK and Germany. In the Western Hemisphere, US forces are escalating their military presence, threats to Venezuela, and pirate-style hits in international waters. Stay tuned for the interview with Donald Ramotar for more on that. Citizens activating everywhere can make a critical difference in mobilizing against this destruction and doom, and for policies serving humanity. Of great interest, says Marcia in this lead, is that in that respect, is the initiative by Pope Leo XIV in his speech in St. Peter's Square on October 25th, referring to the historic contributions of Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa, in particular his concept of the coincidentia oppositorum, or the coincidence of opposites, as a method of resolving conflicts. It would certainly be most opportune if President Xi and Trump were to apply it in their discussions this week. In conclusion, we want to urge you to plan to participate in the International Conference of the Schiller Institute and Solidarité et Progrès on November 8th and 9th in Paris, either in person or over the internet. I'm hoping to be there. So we'll be reporting from that circumstance as well. Major international conference the Schiller Institute is hosting in Paris. Okay, so that covers our lead. And now we're going to go through a handful of the slugs, which you can find at eir.news in full. So first thing we want to do is cover some of the more optimistic outlooks, the new developments in the new paradigm. And therefore, I'm going to pass it to Michelle, and she'll take up a couple of those elements.
On the question of ASEAN, Richie Freeman gives us a little bit of background on this group of nations, indicating it was formed in a slug. ASEAN summit strengthens by jointly cultivating new drivers of development. You can read the whole slug. We're just going to take a little bit of information from this. ASEAN was formed in 1967 in Bangkok, and today it comprises the following nations. Consider Brunei, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, Vietnam, and the most recently joined East Timor. So that's quite a few nations. And the biggest trading partner of ASEAN is China, but we're going to look at something a bit newer under a slug from Gretchen Small, which looks at the relationship between ASEAN and the nation of Brazil in the Western Hemisphere, titled Brazil and ASEAN Together for a Prosperous and Peaceful Future. So President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, he's the first Brazilian president to attend an ASEAN summit. So he published an opinion column under the title we just read on October 23rd in a major media outlet in each of the 5 ASEAN member states. Indonesia's Jakarta Post, Cambodia's The Star, Thailand's Bangkok Post, the Vietnam News Agency, and the Philippines Star. His message demonstrates the Global South's growing sense of power that stems from its cooperation. He wrote, "The partnership between Brazil and the association and ASEAN is an example of how it is possible to build a future of peace, stability, and sustainable growth. With complementary and dynamic economies and a shared vision of a just and inclusive international order, we prove that dialogue and cooperation between the Global South are capable of overcoming distances and generating mutual benefits." So he pointed to the potentials for Brazil-ASEAN economic cooperation in everything from trade, which has grown more than 16-fold in the past 25 years, to increased production of food and energy, industrial innovation, digital appliances, such as Brazil's Pix payments system, and environmentalism and other areas of cooperation as well. And Lula noted the implications for peace. He said, alongside economic and technological cooperation, Brazil and ASEAN share a worldview that prioritizes peace, stability, and universalism as foundations of a more just international order. Our common commitment to disarmament, exemplified by the status of nuclear weapon-free zones, demonstrates the conviction that collective security must be based on cooperation and not on the law of the strongest. Through cooperation and friendship, Brazil and ASEAN prove how it is possible for everyone to win in international relations, in a true win-win relationship. Together, we have the chance to right injustices and build a prosperous, sustainable, and peaceful future for all. So that is on that, and we're going to look, as referenced earlier, we're looking for, where did it go? Well, anyway, we're going to look at the slug that covers the meeting of Hungarian Prime Minister Orban with the Pope, and I have found it. So Hungarian Prime Minister Orban and the Pope Leo XIV meet on peace. Hungarian, and this is written by Chris Lewis. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban met with Pope Leo XIV at the Vatican on October 27th and declared that the peace process is active and progressing, despite attempts by Brussels to marginalize Hungary's efforts. Nice. Following their meeting, Orban was quoted in the Hungarian media as saying, "There is a war-opposing network in the world with two focal points. One of power, led by the US president, and one of spirit, found here with the Holy Father. We draw strength, motivation, and blessing from both." End quote. So Orban said the meeting between the American and Russian presidents will still take place. So Orban has set out 4 key goals. 1, a peace agreement between Russia and the United States. 2, a strategic rather than a membership relationship with Ukraine. 3, access to European funds for national development. And 4, the freedom of EU member states to pursue their own energy policies. He says, if someone does not want to buy Russian energy, fine, but do not prevent others who must. So that is from Viktor Orban. Daniel, you got our next item?
Yeah, thank you. Well, that covers some of the good stuff, and so now we're going to go to the bad stuff. So there's some bad stuff going on. We have a slug from Carl Osgood, who covers War and Peace for EIR News. U.S. flexes military force near Venezuela, hits alleged narco boats off Pacific coast. The Trump administration continues to escalate its so-called drug war with more strikes against alleged trafficking boats and military saber rattling, especially against Venezuela. Today, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth announced 3 strikes on 4 boats in the Eastern Pacific, claiming a total of 14 lives, but leaving 1 survivor who has been turned over to Mexican authorities. The October 28 strikes come amidst military escalation. On October 27, for the 3rd time since October 15th, U.S. planes flew a bomber attack demonstration off the coast of Venezuela. This time, it was at least 2 B-1Bs from Grand Forks, North Dakota. They proceeded south with their transponders on. Open-source flight tracking data showed. The B-1s air refueled over Florida before heading farther south. In addition, there are other armed gunships, Ghost Rider II gunships, that have been operating out of Puerto Rico, along with Reaper drones. These have been photographed with live Hellfire missiles, and the Marines' F-35s have been carrying live air-to-air missiles in photos released by the U.S. military, including during their mission with B-52s. Venezuelan authorities described this. Pardon me. Let me go back a little bit. What happened in the meanwhile is that there's been a guided missile destroyer, the USS Gravely, has been docked at Trinidad and Tobago, and it's making a big problem between Venezuela and Trinidad and Tobago. Venezuela has suspended energy agreements with Trinidad and Tobago, which then that nation's officials have described that as hostile. Venezuelan President Maduro accused Trinidad and Tobago of acting as the aircraft carrier of the U.S. empire during his weekly TV show last night, and said he was left with no choice but to pull out of treaties signed with Trinidad and Tobago 10 years ago. Venezuelan authorities described Trinidad and Tobago's decision to host the ship as a provocation, while Trinidad and Tobago's government has said that joint exercises with the U.S. happen regularly. Says, quote, the Prime Minister of Trinidad has decided to join the warmongering agenda of the United States, says the Vice President of Venezuela, Delcy Rodriguez. So that's a development there. You'll hear much more about that from Ramotar, from Donald Ramotar and Dennis Small. In addition, we have news about what Netanyahu and the IDF are up to. There has been an order from Benjamin Netanyahu to the IDF to carry out immediate and powerful strikes in the Gaza Strip, according to his office on October 28th. This statement came out shortly after an incident in which an Israeli soldier was reportedly killed by a sniper in southern Gaza. In response, Hamas issued a statement which reported that its armed wing, Al-Qassam brigades, had found the body of another deceased hostage, but said, quote, we will postpone its delivery, which was scheduled for today, due to violations by the occupation. The statement added, we emphasize that any Zionist escalation will hinder search, digging, and retrieval operations of the bodies, which will lead to a delay in recovering the bodies of the occupation's dead. But even before that, the ceasefire was already under threat by another crisis regarding the 13 remaining bodies. On October 27, Hamas turned over to Israeli authorities a casket which they said contained the remains of a deceased hostage. In the morning, the Israeli side stated that the remains were body parts from a hostage whose remains were partially recovered by Israeli forces in December 2023 and whose family then buried him. The remains returned on October 27 were not any of the 13 deceased hostages killed in Gaza, according to the Times of Israel. The situation has been whipped up into an angry frenzy inside Israel, with Netanyahu expecting to convene the Security Cabinet to discuss how to respond to Hamas's so-called failure to abide by the ceasefire agreement, while his right-wing coalition partners are demanding a return to war. Israel has been violating the ceasefire every day with attacks and refusing to allow in the quantities of relief supplies that they agreed to. A Hamas source speaking to Al Jazeera Arabic accused Israel of deliberately complicating their search process and fabricating lies. And having brought that forward, I'm going to go back to Michelle for the conclusion of our coverage of the daily briefing. So let me do that. We just want to cover this final item about Russian foreign intel, claiming that France plans to send up to 2,000 troops to Ukraine, which is insane and puts the danger of nuclear war at the height. Why don't I go ahead and read it? So, this is from Richard Freeman in our briefing today. The Foreign Intelligence Service of Russia, the so-called SVR, released a statement on October 27 that Macron is preparing to intervene into Ukraine militarily with up to 2,000 soldiers to be deployed. The press bureau's statement emphasized that on Macron's orders, the General Staff of the French Armed Forces is preparing to deploy a military contingent of up to 2,000 soldiers and officers to Ukraine to support the Kiev regime. The core of the force will be made up of assault troops from the French Foreign Legion, primarily from Latin American countries. The legionnaires are already stationed in Poland, bordering Ukraine, and are undergoing intensive combat training, receiving weapons and military gear. It stresses, this statement from the SVR, in France, hundreds of additional hospital beds are being rapidly created to accommodate the wounded. French doctors are undergoing specialized medical training for field work. They claim Paris intends to claim that this is merely a small group of instructors arriving in Ukraine to train mobilized Ukrainian troops. And there was something from the French Army Chief of Staff who told members of the National Assembly's Defense Committee on October 24th that France's land forces will be ready to deploy to Ukraine under the framework of future European security commitments. Quote, "We will be ready to deploy forces under security guarantees if necessary for the benefit of Ukraine." This likely would involve NATO. So the SVR statement indicates that sending French forces would be more immediate. So that covers what's going on, which is, of course, the whole issue. We're on the verge of an exceedingly disastrous world war, which Professor Ted Postol, in his remarks to the International Peace Coalition last Friday, he emphasized, Postol being a leading expert on nuclear weapons at MIT, he emphasized that the launch of a single nuclear warhead would lead to essentially the destruction of human civilization, and that this is not an opinion, but a physical fact, a fact of the physical world. We have a continuing pressure for war coming from the forces of the Western hegemony that are realizing this carcass of the British Empire that is doing everything possible to hold on to power while a new order is emerging, and the philosophical basis for that order, which has been laid out by Helga Zepp LaRouche and her late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, for many decades, is now really coming forward in an amazing way from the Pope Leo, the leader of 1 billion Catholics in the world, is discussing this key method of the coincidence of opposites, which Mrs. Helga Zepp LaRouche in particular has been emphasizing over the recent years as the absolute key to getting ourselves out of this crisis as a human species. Therefore, you can see it could go in one way or the other. We could have a new renaissance. We could have the extinction of mankind. You have to take a role in that. That's why we're doing this program. We want you to help us to share this. We want you to get the EIR Daily out. We're going to continue to build this operation and develop our video presentations. But one of the key things that you can do right away is to take this upcoming video from Donald Ramotar and get it out widely. It is really extremely well informed. As the former president of Guyana, a nation right there in the region with Venezuela, he is better qualified to address this danger of war with Venezuela than most. And you'll learn a lot from this upcoming. And therefore, I'm going to close out this section of the show. Thank you, Michelle. And we're going to go into the interview with former President Donald Ramotar. Thank you very much, and please watch again soon.
Good morning, good afternoon to everyone. My name is Dennis Small, the Ibero-American editor of Executive Intelligence Review, and I'd like to welcome you to this edition of EIR News Live. We are speaking today with Donald Ramotar. President Ramotar is the former president of Guyana from the years 2011 to 2015. He remains a very active spokesman and participant in political activity worldwide in defense of the interests of the global South and in favor of the kind of change of the global economic system which is required to make sure that the nations of the South have not only their political independence, but also economic conditions of development and sovereignty as well. So let me begin by welcoming you to this show, President Ramotar. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
Good. I know you've been following EIR and its publications for a bit of time, and we've had the honor of being able to print some of your articles in our magazine as well. So it's very important for us to have an opportunity to have this kind of chat as well, especially at moments when, as we speak, today is the 26th of October, 2025, there are gathering storm clouds in the Caribbean with the presence of major military force of the United States, which is about to be augmented by the presence of the aircraft carrier group, the Gerald R. Ford. This will bring the presence in the Caribbean, according to some accounts, to a greater strength than what was present in the Eastern Mediterranean and those environs at the time where the United States was defending Israel under the conditions of their attack on Iran. Now, Guyana is a country which is in South America. It borders with Venezuela. It is on the Caribbean Sea. What does this whole situation mean? What does this look like to you?
Well, it is extremely worrying. Since October of 1962, there has not been such a situation in the Caribbean. And based on their experience of 1962, Caribbean leaders have always fought for having the region as a zone of peace, that we didn't want to have military bases in the region. We didn't want to have the presence of heavy military presence in the region because we valued peace. And that also goes with our history. We were all colonialized by various colonizers, and we just want to have in the area to have peace so that we can concentrate on development. The majority of people in our countries are still poor people, and we want to focus our attention on dealing with that issue. And one of the reasons from the very beginning in the early 1970s, when Caricom was formed, one of the at that time the Trinidad and Tobago was the meeting and Chaguaramas meeting, and they had in the chair was Prime Minister Dr. Eric Williams. And one of the things that was emphasized since then was that the Caribbean must remain a zone of peace. And we always resisted having the intervention. Then we know that we had what happened in Cuba in 1962, that experience. And after the Caribbean, we had the tragic interference in Grenada, that after the death of Morris Bishop, the invasion of America and regime change in that country. So right now, the region is extremely worried, and we are very, very concerned with what will happening. In Guyana, I think I am personally very concerned too, because we are right on the border with Venezuela, as you mentioned just now. And any type of intervention, that type of military intervention that we see, that is quite possible, it can cause a lot of refugees coming into our country, and that will create new problems for us, and problems, some of the things that probably we even can't afford. So, but more than that, most important, I don't see the reason for this buildup in the region, and with the American government wanting to overthrow the government of Maduro. The excuse, of course, that they're using is the whole question of drug trafficking. But we know that even up to this year, the United Nations report on drugs, they hardly mentioned Venezuela, one time only in passing, to say that some drugs from Colombia was passing through Venezuela. And the European Union report on drugs didn't even mention Venezuela. So it is very, very clear that drugs is being used as a pretext for a regime change in Venezuela at this point in time. Now, whatever the problem they have with Venezuela, it's the Venezuelan people that have to deal with it. We cannot agree to have military intervention in the region to overthrow government. And what has been happening, I think you saw the images on the television that was released by the United States itself. The boats with small boats that can easily be stopped, easily be boarded. If there were drugs in them, they can easily be confiscated. The people could be arrested, but instead they have chosen to shoot first and destroy any kind of evidence to read or leave a cloud of doubts. I know two persons from Trinidad were killed, and their families are vehemently denying that they were involved in drugs, that they have been fisher folk all the time. The only the only incident that possibly had some drug connection destroyed the submersible vessel that they had that most likely
Right.
would have been carrying drugs. But even that, look at the force that they have in the region. They did not need to kill people like that. And the cost of life means nothing to these people that are trigger happy, and seems killing people that have been done in the Gaza and happening elsewhere seems to be becoming a norm with
Yeah. I
some
mean,
of the
this is like a bad nightmare that keeps repeating, an invasion of a country using some excuse or other that's concocted. That creates conditions of massive refugee flows, change of government, regime change, chaos, and a disaster. I mean, I could tick off 5 or 6 countries right now which have already gone down that path, and we seem to be doing something similar. I would like to discuss the broader implications of this in terms of entering a regime of the law of the jungle, a totally lawless international regimen. But before we do that, I want to mention for our viewers and get your comments on a press release which was issued on October 23rd, just 3 days ago, by 11 former heads of states of member countries within the Caribbean Community, or Caricom. It included yourself for Guyana. It included P.J. Patterson of Jamaica, Keith Rowley of Trinidad and Tobago, the countries Antigua and Barbuda, Belize, Barbados, Dominica, Grenada, Guyana, Jamaica, St. Lucia, and Trinidad and Tobago. A large number of admittedly small countries, but making a very strong unified statement. One of the things that stood out most to me is the statement towards the end, where you and your colleagues state very clearly that, as you say here, the CARICOM governments over the long sweep of time have sought and responded positively to collaborative agreements to combat these nefarious activities, which had just been mentioned, including the drug trade, but consistent with our sovereignty, international law, and intrinsic rights. It seems that the issue of sovereignty is something that is absolutely going by the wayside here. Do you have anything you want to add about this statement and how it was drafted?
Yeah, well, the initiative fundamentally came from former Prime Minister of Jamaica, P.J. Patterson. I think he was the one that was taking the initiative, and I immediately agreed with him and decided to associate my name with uh, that statement, because our history itself, we have been colonies for hundreds of years. This area has been an area of where the slave trade and indentured laborers, a lot of forced laborers and oppression in our region, that is our history, and therefore we value our sovereignty very, very much in this region. One of the ironic things too that I want to point out that has happened, the Americans who invaded Grenada in 1983 on the grounds that the airport that they was being built by the Cubans was going to be a military airport for the Cubans and Russians. That turned out to be untrue. But now they're putting a lot of pressure on the government of Grenada for them to establish military assets there, which is because it's very close to Venezuela as well, to carry out their activity. And one of the things that has become very pronounced, particularly in this with previous regimes too, with previous governments in the United States as well, but this one in particular, is that it seems to be force and fear seems to be the main instrument that they're using in order in international relations. And in our region, because as you know, we're small countries, we don't have big military and so forth. That pressure is very, very strong and pronounced on leaders of the Caribbean. That is why we thought that it was important that the former leaders of government and state, that we come out with a statement and urge the present governments in the region to stand firm in order to on the very principle which we think is very important, that the Caribbean should remain a zone of peace. Apart from that, I mean, most of the Caribbean countries, as I said in the statement that you mentioned, most of the countries depend on tourism for their economic development and for the welfare of their people. And something like this is going to be devastating to the economy of most of the countries in the region as well. So it is extremely concerning. The region is very tense at the moment, and we are still hoping, although the amount of military assets that's been accumulated in the Southern Caribbean right now is so great that it seems almost as if it's inevitable that in some invasion will take place. But we are still fighting against it and hoping that we can stop it before it starts.
You know, one of the ironies in this situation, again, is that the arguments about airports being built in other countries, there is a very big push coming from financial interests in the City of London and Wall Street, expressed through the State Department and the Southern Command in the United States, to establish a military presence in Ecuador, in other places, and so on, for the purpose of making sure, and they are very explicit about this, that nobody can have any economic relations with China or with the
Yeah,
Belt and Road Initiative.
yeah,
And the idea of using drugs as an excuse, whereas you pointed out, most of the drugs don't even go through that route. They're mainly through the Pacific side, going into Mexico and across the border. And I should emphasize, through the actual border crossings, the official border crossings, where most of the drugs come through. But the actual agenda, as they have not been shy about stating, is to make sure that there is no possibility of China and the Belt and Road getting a foothold, i.e. having an economic participation in the whole region, South America, North America, and so on. Is this, in your view, part of why we are seeing really what seems to be a return to the law of the jungle in international relations generally?
yes, I think you're quite correct. I think that there is concern in the United States upper class, the people who run the United States itself, that they afraid of China, not because China is threatening them militarily, but because of China's policy of peace, and it is attracting a lot of, it's very attractive, the Belt and Road Initiative that China has elaborated. It's very, very attractive for all of us in the third world. We have had a tremendous deficit in infrastructure that is important for social and economic development. So too are many other countries. And I think the Americans and the Western European countries in the past, all they did was did extraction from us through various means and left us with actually nothing. It's only now that China is here that we are building up our infrastructure that can facilitate economic growth. And I believe that is one of the fears, that China's attitude in helping and developing countries in mutual assistance, because of course China is benefiting from this and so forth, but it's doing it in an affordable way, creating conditions where paying back some of the loans that are taken to build some of these infrastructure has been very favorable to developing countries, I think the Americans in particular see this as a big threat. And
Well, but
they are trying.
should the United States be fearful of this or view this as a threat? Is there a
I
basis
don't think
for
so.
cooperation?
There's absolutely no there's absolutely no fear of any kind of military actions. Uh, but I think that the Americans are not afraid of that. They just want to try to stop China from assisting developing countries. So in order for them to maintain their complete dominance, they don't want to have any other country developing their influence within our region, particularly the way that China is doing in a very tangible way of helping developing countries to progress.
Well,
Uh,
as you know, the LaRouche movement and EIR magazine and the Schiller Institute have been strong advocates inside the United States that it is actually in our national interest as Americans to cooperate with China, to work with Russia, to find areas where we can have not conflict but cooperation, such as, for example, on the issue of constructing a tunnel under the Bering Strait. This is something which has actually been on the agenda between the United States and Russia going back a century and a half. It's come up recently with the Russian side through Kirill Dmitriev, the special envoy of the Kremlin, raising this as a possible basis for cooperation. So the idea that instead of conflict, we could have cooperation is something that we have promoted very broadly. And I think the attitude in the South is similar. Helga Zepp-LaRouche has frequently said, you've heard her say this yourself, President Ramotar, that if the United States would simply offer to work with China or countries in the global South, such as the Caribbean, they would immediately welcome this with open arms. Is that your sense of the environment in the Caribbean?
yes, yes, I'm sure. I mean, look, the thing is, Dennis, is that the United States has such a potential for doing good. They have a huge potential for that, but instead, their leadership in the country um, are not using that great potential that they have to do good and to build goodwill throughout the world and toward world countries. Instead, they choose to take a hostile position and they're taking a position more of exploiting our natural resources and so forth. And instead of cooperating like China, I think that China has a philosophy that is very much needed in our world today, and a philosophy of mutual dependence on each other. Because I think they believe that if they can make our countries prosperous, it makes China prosperous and improve the question of trade and all of that that can increase those things. Unfortunately, lately I think the attitude of the United States is not giving them the kind of results that they want, except in destruction that is happening all over the world. But it's not giving them, because when they try to prevent China from having chips, China is now developing their own chips and
Right.
becoming very powerful in that regard. When they try to stop selling airplane parts to Russia, Russia is developing its own aerospace industry and therefore cutting back trade. Instead of buying Boeing and Airbus and so forth, they are building their own aircraft now. And it's having a negative effect, but it doesn't seem to be hitting home at the ruling elite in the US that what they're doing is harming themselves more than anything else at this point in time.
You've often spoken about the direction that the world's institutions are going in at this point, looking at bodies such as the United Nations or the International Court of Justice, or other of the major post-war institutions. And you've commented in your speeches and articles and elsewhere that you really see a descent into a kind of lawless system where the institutions themselves are being decimated. Could you explain that a little further and what your concerns are here?
Well, for instance, let me just give you one example. Let's take the ICC, the International Criminal Court. And they quickly issued an arrest warrant for President Putin in 2023, when he was all that the Russian government was doing was trying to move children out of a war zone. They put them in a safer place. They turned that into say that they were kidnapping children and immediately issued a arrest warrant. But Netanyahu, look how long they took and the kind of pressure that the whole world had to be putting before they have reached the stage of issuing. And then look at the attitude of the United States of banning and the prosecutor, the chief prosecutor, judges from the International Court of Justice. Look at them joining up with Israel and the ICJ to fight down against the case that South Africa has brought against them. And then look at Iran. Iran's complaint about the IAEA, in which they feel that that organization is being used by Western powers, Israel and the United States, to spy on them, and that is how they killed their scientists and military people in their homes when they were not expecting anything like this to happen. And even I heard an interview with Foreign Minister Lavrov, who even spoke about the Secretariat in the United Nations being used by the US and the West in a very partisan type of way. So all of these, I think there's a deliberate attempt to undermine these institutions or to put them under their control, to use them to work maybe with their intelligence bodies that they have. And if they can't get them in their own way, there's a deliberate attempt to try to destroy them. And that is extremely dangerous for us, particularly small states like Guyana and the Caribbean, states in the Caribbean, where we depend on our protection and to preserve our sovereignty. We depend on international law and the international institutions that exist today.
You know, I think the damage done by the destruction of international law, although it may be seen as perhaps less of a problem for large countries like the United States or Germany and so on, in fact, is equally devastating to the impact on the South, not in terms of the scale of your daily activities, but undermining the very principles on which our societies have been founded, like the idea of the Treaty of Westphalia, which was based on a concept of sovereign countries respecting each other's sovereignty, helping each other develop, and have a kind of win-win approach, not beggar thy neighbor, but what Prime Minister Mahathir used to call prosper thy neighbor. So by destroying that underlying concept, we're teetering at the edge of the destruction of the very institutions on which countries like the United States as well have been founded. I'll just mention for the benefit of our readers that the situation in Germany today is quite alarming, with the imposition of police state type measures to silence anybody who expresses any disagreement. The latest is there was a warrant against Jürgen Todenhofer, now aged 84, a former Secretary of State in the country, a warrant which hasn't been executed yet, but trying to raid his house, his equipment, and his person to silence him because he criticized Prime Minister Netanyahu. So I mention this as just as a single example to underscore the point that you're making. It seems to me what we're talking about here is that security has to be indivisible. Everybody has to have security.
Yeah, exactly.
And development also has to be indivisible. Everybody has to have development. So we're talking, are we not, about a new security and development architecture? Is that direction we should be going?
I think so. I think we need all this talk about reform of the United Nations and so forth. I think it has to include what you're talking about there, about the new security arrangement, where, because it has been said, and the case is, I think the case is unassailable, that when the United Nations was set up, there was only 51 countries. Now you have 100, more than 190 countries there. So there definitely needs to be um, a discussion of of democratizing those type of society, because those institutions are still, while we fight for them to remain and to try to be uphold the international law, but they still definitely serve the more developed countries that created the United Nations and a lot of these bodies in the 1940s, immediately after the war. So there seems to be, for want of a better word, a need to have a greater involvement of the whole world at this point in time to assess where we are, to see that our third world countries are very, very serious about their sovereignty, and to try as far as possible to ensure that power is distributed internationally, where all of us can have a say in how our world is run. After all, we only have, we know that scientists are saying that in outer space, the probability that there is life outside there, and I believe that too, but at the moment, we only know one world, and we have to try to defend it as much as possible.
There's no question that the institutions that were set up after the Second World War um, lacked in a couple of areas some fundamental questions, like even the IMF had absolutely no voice really for the global South. I think the concept that President Roosevelt had was a very different one than the one that Churchill had, and would have evolved perhaps to be more inclusive of the global South, or the third world, as you call it, had he lived longer and had that been able to progress, because Roosevelt was emphatically anti-colonial and Churchill was emphatically pro-colonial, obviously. But this brings me to the final or semi-final central point I want to ask you, which has to do again with the role of the third world or the global South, and your particular role. In 2013, again, I'll remind readers that President Ramotar was president of Guyana from 2011 to 2015. In 2013 was the year when Xi Jinping announced the formation of the Belt and Road Initiative. It wasn't called that at the time. I believe it was One Belt, One Road. That was 2013. In 2014, there was an extremely important meeting of the BRICS in Brazil, which was one of the places in the whole trajectory of the BRICS where they really established themselves as a major voice demanding the development of the South. And it was chaired by then President Dilma Rousseff of Brazil, and you, President Ramotar, were present as one of the guests from South America there. Today, we have a world which is really at the brink. As someone who has been on the front line of the battles in the global South for many decades, what is your message through EIR? What is your message through this interview to the people listening about the direction that this has to go?
Well, I think, as you mentioned, that meeting in 2013 in Brazil, we had a meeting with the BRICS countries together with Latin America and the Caribbean, other Latin America and the Caribbean countries there. And I think the consensus of that meeting was that that was the way to go. And I would say that the proposal by President Xi Jinping coincides completely with your organization's position that you have with this, the developmental project that you have proposed, LaRouche has proposed a very long time ago. There's a lot of similarities, and I believe some of the intention that moved President Xi Jinping was the same kind of intention that LaRouche had about creating a massive development in both the North and the South. It was not only a question of of the north of the south developing, because the south, of course, have the huge scope for development because of the underdevelopment that we have. But the sustainability of the north depends now on the development of the south, on the prosperity of the south. That if the south develops, then the north can continue to develop and increase in their development. And I think that is the essence that you have grasped, your organization have grasped, and the proposal by President Xi Jinping, I think he has grasped that too, that it is a kind of a dependence that helping the third world to develop and become prosperous and end poverty in the world and so forth is also guaranteeing the further development of the North and consolidation of the North to give it a guarantee that it will grow. But if the South continues to remain poor and backward, it will have a drag on the North as well. And we can see that in look at what's happening in Europe. I think some of the problems in Europe is connected to the fact that the South, which can help them more if the people can come out of poverty, get greater purchasing power, do more trade with them, that they will have less of a problem. Because Europe, in a way, has an advantage over the United States and even China, because they have had relationship with the people in the South for a longer time. And people in the South have been able to deal with them for a while. And if they have a different outlook, instead of only, now the colonies, most of the former colonies are now objecting that they still want to maintain the colonialism in the new time, the new neo-colonialism in a way. Right. That is what they're objecting to, but I don't think they're objecting to working with them, because in many, many ways they have helped form our cultures, and many, many ways the Europe has helped us contributed in that direction. And I'm sure that the third world would like to cooperate with them, but they want to have a relationship that they had, that the time has passed for those things. So I would say that that proposal in 2013 that was made by President Xi Jinping had a big impact. I think the more we move away from that time, the more we will see the importance and the significance of that proposal that was made and the impact that it's having on the world at this point in time.
Right. So I guess it's would be safe to say that you consider the publications and intelligence of Executive Intelligence Review as something that you would encourage others to subscribe to as well.
Yes. I think you do a great job. You have really profound analysis. You have good people writing, and the orientation that you have in trying to make a better world is what makes your analysis so good.
Thank you, President Ramotar. We absolutely share this fundamental outlook that you stated at the very conclusion, that the benefit of the other, from the standpoint of the North, the benefit of the South is our own benefit. And if we don't develop a world that moves along those lines, we will be heading to the law of the jungle, and that could mean nuclear extermination in this day and age. Thanks for your interview. Thanks for everything.
Yes, I would like to comment to say that now that you raised this question with nuclear, I think we need to also, because look, there's a crisis in leadership in many of the developed world and so forth. And when you imagine some of these people got in their hands the power of unleashing a nuclear war, and look at the quality of the leadership that they're providing in the world, it is extremely frightening. So I think for our organization, poorer countries, democratic organization, peaceful organization that wants to insist on a peaceful world, I think we have to put back on the agenda very strongly the whole question of limiting and eventually getting rid of these weapons of mass destruction, particularly nuclear weapons, because it will kill all of us, those of us who have and those that don't have nuclear weapons. If it is ever used, it can destroy all of us. And I think we need to have a big say into that, because our lives are also at stake with these type of weapons that are used. And the only way to ensure the safety of our world is to get rid of these weapons of mass destruction. And I think that those things should come back on the agenda in a strong way, as we have seen it in the 1970s and 1980s when there was a strong push. We need to get back that spirit to fight for disarmament. Disarmament needs to be put back on the agenda in a major way.
Thank you, President Ramotar. You've been listening to the former president of Guyana, Donald Ramotar. Thanks for listening to EIR News Live, and we'll see you back in the next episode. Thanks.